There's one thing I really have to be honest about when it comes to photography. So many explanations out there. But if you really want to understand what exposure triangle is, look no further. I will simplify what has been made to seem like science. Well, of course, photography is science, but some explanations that are out there online are so confusing, especially for those that are starting in photography. So many explanations on exposure triangles. The simplest, most easiest way of explaining what exposure triangle is that it's the concept of manipulating three variables that influence how a photograph is exposed. These three variables include shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now, in further understanding what exposure triangle is, we have to go into aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, and how all those three work together to give you that perfect exposed picture. Aperture. Aperture is nothing but how wide the iris of the lens is open, or how small the iris of the lens is open. The higher the number of the aperture, the smaller the iris. The smaller the number of the aperture, the wider the iris of the lens is. By lowering the number of the f-stop or aperture, for example, 1.8 or 1.4 is going to be extra open wide, which means it allows more light to come in. The smaller the iris of the lens means the higher the number. Some lenses go all the way to f22. If you find yourself shooting at f22, the iris of the aperture is small. The smaller it is, that means the number is high. So f22 means smaller iris. f1.4 means the iris is wide open, therefore allowing more light. Shutter speed. The shutter speed is basically working in conjunction with the aperture. How much light is allowed in the camera is therefore collected, or rather, think of the shutter as a gatekeeper of how much light is allowed at a certain period. That's why it's measured in 1/5 of a second. So if you want to freeze time, if you want to freeze a picture, you want to go 1/2000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second. So it's how fast and how quick it collects that light. All right. If you want to blur out your motions, like if you want to use you shooting waterfalls or lights that are passing by from cars, and if you want to create that trailing blaze, you slow down your shutter speed all the way to a second, 2 seconds. I've seen people go as far as 5 seconds, which is overkill, by the way. But the faster the shutter speed, you freeze frame, basically everything stops. The slower the shutter speed, which is the lower the number of a shutter speed, which means it drags because it stays wide open as it gathers all the information via light that is allowed by the aperture, and when it shuts off, the picture has been captured. So sometimes when you have it open and it stays open for a while, that means it's collecting information for that long. And when you close it, which you hear it click, that means the gate is closed, information collected. If it stays open for too long, it is collecting information. That is why you get the trailing light, because as light moves along, it's collecting that information via the aperture that is allowing the light to go in through the lens. So we have those two now working in connection with each other. The last one is ISO. The ISO is nothing but how sensitive the sensor is to the light that is allowed in. So now in a nutshell, we know that whenever we're working with exposure triangle, the triad consists of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And those work hand in hand. Now there's a fourth dimension to this concept. Every camera has a meter which shows you the level of light that is allowed in, and you want it basically at 0. Unless if you're going for high key images, then you can allow it to go more on the right or if you're going for low-key photography, and you can allow it to go below 0. But other than that, you want your pictures to be at 0. That ensures that your image is perfectly exposed. How do you get to that point? Very simple. A portrait photographer is only concerned with the aperture. And then when you dial in the aperture that is desired, then you want to concentrate on the ISO and then work towards getting the proper shutter speed. But remember, your priority is the aperture. That's for a portrait photographer, anybody that shoots in a studio. Now, when you get not too long ago, I have a video. My previous video is when I was at Grand Prix. When you're shooting things that are in fast motion, things that are moving fast, you want to freeze time, at the same time get the perfect exposure. So now when you're freezing time, guess what? For sports photographers, the priority in that realm is the shutter speed. Why? Because you want to freeze time as the cars are moving by. Similar to when I went to Grand Prix, my priority on that day was nothing but freezing motion, which means I had to work with, as I went as high as 1/2000th of a second to slow down, actually to freeze time, right? And then after I dialed in the perfect shutter speed for freezing cars that were moving past really fast, then I moved forward into getting my aperture correct. Remember, sports photography, whether NFL, soccer, or whatever you shoot, boxing, anything that moves fast, your priority will be the shutter speed. Okay, now when we go into night photography, your priority becomes the ISO, because you want to basically ISO is fake light. All right, it's how sensitive your camera is or your lens is to light. And if you want to compensate and add artificial light, ISO does that for you. Now be warned, the higher the ISO, you risk introducing what is called noise, right? That's where you see all those dots in your pictures and it looks kind of ugly, and you have to put it in post and try and fix it in that way, and then your pictures start looking plasticky. That's why I don't even touch the ISO. I prefer to struggle with aperture and shutter speed. When you're dealing with ISO, you're risking introducing noise. So if I'm shooting at night and I know that it's going to be a stress shooting at night because I'm dealing with darkness and underexposing my pictures, your best friend in that moment is the flash, speed light, depending on which country you're in, or it doesn't matter, it's a speed light. All right, the speed light is there to compensate for anything that you're lacking. If you fail to work with the triangle that is in camera, aperture, ISO, and your shutter speed, then you introduce a speed light. Again, be warned, you don't want to shoot anybody directly like this, or else you get that blown away face. Or that's actually, let's leave this for another tutorial. Remember the three variables that we're working with? The three variables are aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And then you have the fourth dimension, which is the judge. Basically, it's the meter. The meter will cry out and say, hey, 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 whatever you have dialed on your camera, it's underexposed. And you're gonna know this because the exposure meter moves all the way below 0. Your image is underexposed. Bump up your ISO, open up your aperture, or the lower the shutter speed allows more light to come in. The higher the shutter speed freezes time, the darker your image will be. All right. But we can go on and on and on. Leave your comments below if I missed anything and I didn't cover anything as it relates to this, the exposure triangle, but I tried to make it as simple as possible, contrary to a lot of photography scientists out there that want to overcomplicate something so simple. Hit that like button if you like the video, smash that subscribe button if you aren't already, hit that little bell that is right next to the subscribe button, and I will see you on the next video. Peace. So, how was that? Was that good? All right. All right. I don't know. For some reason, I felt like today I went on and on and on. Huh? Another take? Doing what? Oh. Oh, I got you. All right. One more take? Why? I'm doing one shot today, man. One take. All right? We're doing one take today. No, it's I gotta go to work in the morning. Yeah. Camera's still rolling. Right there. All right, cut it. All right. No. Oh, okay. Well, let's do it now.